On October 21, 1941, at a time when Britain was still fighting for survival, the first Sten Mark I submachine guns were being delivered to the British military. The weapon looked almost embarrassingly crude. A thin metal body, a tubular receiver, a wooden stock and foregrip on the earliest version, a magazine projecting awkwardly from the left side. There was little of the polished craftsmanship associated with traditional British firearms. It looked less like a precision weapon than something assembled from plumbing supplies. And yet this strange-looking machine carbine was about to become one of the most widely produced weapons of the Second World War. The Sten was born from a simple wartime reality. Britain needed automatic weapons, and it needed them in enormous numbers. The German MP-38 and MP-40 had demonstrated the value of compact automatic fire, while Britain entered the war without its own modern submachine gun. American Thompsons could fill part of the gap, but they were expensive and complicated compared with what a nation fighting a global industrial war actually required. The answer came from two men at the Royal Small Arms Factory, Enfield, Major Reginald Shepherd and senior draftsman Harold Turpin. Their designs sacrificed elegance for speed, economy, and simplicity. The result was not the finest-looking firearm of the war. It was never intended to be. It was intended to be made. And that distinction would define the Sten's entire history. Britain's problem became particularly serious after the fall of France in 1940. The British Expeditionary Force had been evacuated from Dunkirk, but much of its heavy equipment had been abandoned in France. The country now faced the possibility of invasion while simultaneously preparing to rebuild and expand its armed forces. Small arms presented their own industrial challenge. A submachine gun could provide a soldier with a high volume of short-range fire, making it particularly useful for specialists such as commandos, airborne troops, vehicle crews, and other personnel who could not conveniently carry a full-length rifle. Germany already had weapons in this category, most famously the MP-38 and MP-40. Britain had no equivalent in large-scale domestic production. The Thompson offered an immediate solution. British forces acquired American-made Thompsons, but the weapon was expensive, relatively heavy, and chambered for the American .45 cartridge. More importantly, Britain could not simply depend upon American production while fighting a war in which shipping, steel, machinery, and industrial capacity were all under pressure. Britain needed something different. The requirement was not for a beautifully engineered firearm produced slowly by highly skilled craftsmen. It was for a weapon that could be produced rapidly, cheaply, and in enormous quantities using Britain's dispersed industrial base. That requirement shaped the Sten before the first prototype had even been completed. At the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield, Harold Turpin worked with Major Reginald Shepherd on a design that would use the 9mm cartridge already associated with European military weapons. The name itself came from the designers and the factory, Shepherd, Turpin, and Enfield. The first design emerged in late 1940. A prototype was completed in January 1941, and testing followed rapidly. The urgency was unmistakable. Britain did not have the luxury of spending years refining a new weapon. The first production model was the Sten MKI. It was still comparatively elaborate by the standards that would follow. It had wooden furniture and a more conventional appearance, including features that were soon recognized as unnecessary for a weapon whose greatest virtue was supposed to be ease of manufacture. The designers quickly simplified it. The MKI was followed by the MKI*, and then by the Sten MK2, which became the defining version of the weapon. The MK2 removed much of the unnecessary complexity and relied heavily on simple metal components, welding and machining only where essential. Its operating system was straightforward. The Sten fired from an open bolt using simple blowback operation. A 32-round magazine fed 9mm ammunition into the weapon from the left side. There was no elaborate gas system and no complicated locking mechanism demanding precision manufacture. That simplicity mattered. The Sten was roughly 7.1 pounds, or 3.2 kilograms, for the MK2. It was compact enough to be useful in close quarters and comparatively easy to transport. But the real innovation was not something visible when a soldier held the weapon. It was hidden inside the factory. The Sten was designed around manufacturing. Instead of demanding large quantities of carefully machined components, the design used tube, sheet metal, simple pressings, and welding. One contemporary assessment described a remarkably small number of parts, with only a few requiring significant machining. Components could therefore be manufactured in different factories and brought together for final assembly. This opened a completely different industrial possibility. A weapon no longer had to come from one traditional arms factory staffed entirely by highly skilled gunsmiths. It could emerge from a network of factories, subcontractors, and workers whose previous experience might have been in entirely different industries. This became particularly important as Britain expanded its wartime production system. The Royal Ordnance Factory at Fazakerley, near Liverpool, became one of the major Sten-producing centers. Other private companies and government factories joined the effort. Components could be made in different locations, transported and assembled elsewhere. The system was remarkably adaptable. One of the clearest demonstrations came from Lyne's Brothers, better known before the war for making toys. Its engineers specialized in pressed sheet metal, and in 1941 the company proposed a redesigned Sten suited to its own manufacturing equipment. The resulting Mk3 used sheet steel extensively and could be produced extremely quickly. The Royal Armouries records that Lyne's Brothers reduced manufacturing time to around 5.5 hours per gun for its Mk3 process. An initial contract for 500,000 weapons was completed on time by running 3 shifts around the clock. The transformation was extraordinary. The Sten had become less a traditional firearm than an industrial product. That was precisely what Britain needed. But the weapon's simplicity came with consequences. The Sten's reputation was never uniformly positive. Its magazine feed could be troublesome, and the crude construction meant that the weapon did not have the refined handling or finish of a Thompson. Some versions also developed a reputation for accidental discharges under particular circumstances. The Sten was a compromise, and soldiers could feel those compromises. Yet there was another side to the story. A weapon that was inexpensive, compact, simple, and available could be more useful to an army than a superior weapon that existed only in limited numbers. And availability was where the Sten became difficult to ignore. British production accelerated dramatically. Official historical production figures show domestic output rising from just 250 Stens in November 1941 to more than 96,000 in March 1942. The scale continued to expand. More than 4 million Stens were ultimately produced during the war, with commonly cited figures around 4.3 million, although the exact total varies according to how production outside Britain and clandestine manufacture are counted. This is where the title of the story requires an important correction. The Sten was not literally the most produced firearm of the entire Second World War. Rifles such as the Soviet Mosin-Nagant and other mass-produced weapons existed in enormous numbers. Nor was the Sten the world's most produced submachine gun. The Soviet PPSH-41 exceeded it in production. What the Sten became was something more specific and, in its own way, remarkable. One of the most produced submachine guns of the war, and Britain's great wartime example of designing a firearm around mass production. If you're enjoying this journey through history, subscribing genuinely helps us continue bringing remarkable, true stories like this to the channel. The Sten's usefulness became particularly clear when Britain began operating across Europe. It went to conventional infantry units, airborne forces, commandos, and the Home Guard. It was also supplied to resistance movements in occupied Europe. Its compact form made it practical for clandestine operations, while its comparatively simple construction made the weapon easier to manufacture outside normal industrial systems. Some Stens even appeared in German hands after capture. The Wehrmacht gave captured examples German designations, demonstrating an important truth about wartime equipment. Weapons did not always remain on the side that originally manufactured them. The Sten was also present during some of the most important Allied operations of the war. British and Commonwealth airborne troops carried Stens during the Normandy campaign. Commandos used them in the specialized environment for which compact automatic weapons were particularly suitable. Resistance groups received thousands of weapons through Allied supply networks. But the Sten was not a miracle weapon. It did not turn poorly equipped units into elite formations. It did not replace the rifle as the basic infantry weapon. Its effective role was relatively specialized, particularly in close-range fighting where compactness and automatic fire were valuable. That distinction matters because the Sten's greatest achievement was not tactical brilliance. It was logistical. The comparison with the American Thompson makes this particularly clear. The Thompson was a substantially more refined weapon, with excellent construction and a reputation for durability. But it was expensive and relatively labor-intensive to produce. The Sten approached the problem from the opposite direction. The Soviet PPSH-41 provides an even more revealing comparison. Like the Sten, it was designed around mass production and used extensive stamped and machined components. But the PPSH generally used a larger 7.62 mm Soviet cartridge and could accept a 71-round drum as well as a box magazine. The PPSH was extremely prolific, with production exceeding that of the Sten. The American M3, often called the grease gun, represented another similar wartime philosophy. It was also deliberately simple and cheap compared with earlier American submachine guns. These weapons were not identical, and they were not created independently of the same circumstances by accident. Industrial warfare had changed the economics of weapons design. The question was no longer simply, how good can this firearm be? Increasingly, it was, how many can we make, how quickly, and with how little scarce industrial capacity? The Sten provided Britain's answer. Its wider impact, therefore, needs to be measured carefully. The weapon did not transform infantry tactics. It did not make rifles obsolete. It did not decide battles by itself. Its importance was more practical. It gave Britain a domestic source of compact, automatic weapons at a time when imported alternatives were expensive and difficult to obtain in sufficient quantities. It could be produced through a dispersed manufacturing network. It could be supplied to a wide variety of forces. And it demonstrated the value of designing a weapon around the realities of industrial warfare. The Sten also revealed something uncomfortable about modern war. Craftsmanship had not disappeared. It had simply been joined by another form of engineering, the engineering of production. A finely made firearm could be an impressive object, but during a global war involving millions of soldiers, a firearm that could be produced quickly, repaired reasonably easily, and supplied in vast numbers had a different kind of value. By 1944, Britain could afford to improve the Sten rather than merely simplify it. The Sten Mk.V introduced better furniture and improved handling, giving the basic mechanism a more conventional military appearance. It was a recognition that once production shortages had eased, some of the compromises of the earlier guns could be reduced. The contrast between the crude Mk2 and the more refined Mk.V tells the story of Britain's wartime industrial journey in miniature. At first, there was barely enough. Then there was enough. And eventually there was room to improve. Today, surviving Stens can be found in major firearms collections, including the National Firearms Center of the Royal Armouries, which holds thousands of firearms along with technical information, photographs, and engineering records. Look closely at a Sten, and it is easy to understand why generations of soldiers and historians have described it as crude. The metal is plain. The shape is awkward. There is little ornament. Nothing about it announces precision craftsmanship. But that is almost a wrong standard by which to judge it. Return to Britain in 1941. Factories are working under pressure. Raw materials are being allocated according to military priority. Skilled labor is scarce. German submarines threaten the shipping lanes. Britain is preparing forces for battles whose scale cannot yet be fully known. In that environment, beauty is secondary. Availability is everything. The Sten emerged from that reality. It was not designed to impress a gunsmith examining it on a workbench. It was designed to reach the hands of soldiers who needed a compact automatic weapon and could not wait for something more sophisticated. That is why the Sten story is larger than the weapon itself. It is the story of a country adapting its industrial culture to total war. The men who designed it did not create a perfect firearm. They created a firearm whose imperfections were, to a remarkable extent, acceptable because the design solved the problem that mattered most. Quantity. More than 4 million Stens were produced during the war, making the weapon an unmistakable symbol of British wartime mass production. But numbers alone do not explain its historical importance. The Sten mattered because it existed when Britain needed it, in the form Britain could afford to manufacture. Its ugly appearance was not evidence that British engineers had forgotten how to build fine weapons. It was evidence that they understood the demands of the moment. The Sten was cheap because Britain needed cheap weapons. It was simple because Britain needed simple manufacturing. It was rough because speed mattered more than finish. And when the war demanded millions of firearms rather than thousands of masterpieces, those decisions proved their value. The Sten never became the most made firearm of the Second World War in the literal global sense. But it became something perhaps more revealing. One of the clearest expressions of how industrial warfare changed the meaning of good design. The most important part of the Sten was never the metal tube, the magazine, or the trigger. It was the idea behind them. In a war measured in factories as much as battlefields, the winning weapon was not always the most elegant one. Sometimes it was the one that could simply keep coming.